So a couple weeks ago, I was watching the Texas-Alabama game. Still too soon to mention that? And I thought, my goodness, if Texas pulls this off and beats Alabama, that would be another proof for the existence of God. But anyway, What We Can't Not Know, that's the title of a book by Jay Budziszewski, who's a philosophy professor here at UT. It's the moral law he's talking about. And but I'm going to talk about a bunch of things today, but we're going to start at the very beginning and get with the guts. But the most important question that we're going to be talking about, the existence of God, it's the most important question that there is. Because we live in two vastly, wildly different universes if God exists and if he doesn't. All right? And the consequences for getting that wrong are potentially horrific. So I'm going to say some things today about atheism. I'm not going to be attacking atheists, because our Lord died for them, just like he died for us. So it's the idea, and Paul says in 2 Corinthians 10:5 that we're destroying speculations. All right, he uses the word destroy. And so that's what I'm going to try to do today. I'm going to try to destroy. I'd love to be here in January. Okay, down boy. Of course we have free will. And of course God exists. And that's what we can't not know that, all right? Everybody can't not know that. And I hope to show you today why I make that claim. My approach is going to be very scientific, empirical in nature. We're going to start with observation and reason back to cause, all right? It's going to be logically rigorous, and I'll explain how the arguments work. And I promise you that they're valid and they're sound, which means that the conclusions are absolutely certain, all right? And just a quick illustration. For a categorical syllogism, if the major premise is 50 is less than 100, and the minor premise is that 25 is less than 50, what do we know about the relationship between 25 and 100? 25 is less than 100, right? I mean, we know that. There's no way that cannot be true. And so, in the same way, we're going to know that God exists. You can't not know that. You can reject it. Okay, and you can blather on about how you're too intellectual to believe in fairy tales and, what's the great spaghetti monsters and things like that, okay? But I hope to wreck that idea this morning. So the rejection of God is not about intelligence or rationality. Okay, now there's two big pictures I'm going to sort of be comparing and contrasting today. The first one is ours. And it's true because it's capitalized, our big picture. No. And our big picture in a nutshell is that God exists. Now, this is a conclusion of an argument based upon evidence and reason, as we'll see. In other words, if I just say that God exists, that could be true, it could be false, right? If I say God does not exist, well, that could be true, that could be false. So we have to have an argument for why we say that. And I'm going to make several of those today, why we say that he does. Now, he reveals himself in our worldview through nature and through his Son and through his Word. But today, I'm just going to talk about nature, revelation, general revelation. Okay, this is going to be no references to Scripture, so somebody can't say, oh, well, you're just saying that because the Bible says it. Nah, I'm not, all right? Jesus, in our worldview, being God, should be believed. And we probably ought to pay attention to him because there's consequences for not. If he is who he says he is, all right? And we are created in his image. That's what, in a nutshell, that we propose. That last thing, we're created in his image. You ever stop and think about that? I could get up here and say, hi, I'm Tom. I'm created in the image of God. That sounds so absurd to me, but it's true, and it's true of all of you. and think about this vast, vast, vast universe that we're in. And now with the Webb telescope, they're thinking maybe there's 2 trillion galaxies, up from 400 billion. And on this one little planet in this solar system, in the Milky Way galaxy, there's us. Out of this whole universe, there's us that are created in the image of God. Wow, that's a pretty amazing thing. Okay, so their big picture. There is no God. Now, this is a conclusion of materialism. And what materialism is, essentially, and you'll hear it called naturalism or physicalism, is that the material world, the sensible world, is all there is. Okay, there's nothing beyond that. And so the argument would go like this. Only material things exist. It's your major premise. God is not a material thing, being. And we would agree with that, right? God's not material. Well, Jesus is, but the Trinity's not. Most of the Trinity. Therefore, God does not exist. Well, in the same way that I said God doesn't exist, could be true, could be false, the same could be said about only the material world exists. Well, that could be true, that could be false. So you begin, that argument begins in uncertainty. Actually, it begins in error, but at best it begins in uncertainty. And so your conclusion, it ends in uncertainty. So you haven't advanced the argument at all. All right? In materialism, and we'll see this too later on, I hope, it's ridiculous. Okay, there's no Jesus in the atheist worldview. There's no heaven, no hell. There's no right or wrong. There's no free will. There's no purpose. There's no design. Only the material world is real. The world of sensation, what we can see and hear and touch and taste and so on. Okay. Now, I've got some quotations that I want to read to you here real quick of the intellectuals on the atheist side of the ledger. Now, Daniel Dennett, he's a philosopher. He wrote a book called Darwin's Dangerous Idea back in the 80s or 90s. It was a big deal, and in it he poo-poos, religion and free will. Anyway, what he says, in the theory of Darwinian evolution, absolute ignorance, and this is a quotation criticizing Darwin that he puts in his book. Absolute ignorance is the designer, so that we may state as the fundamental principle of the whole system that in order to make a perfect and beautiful machine, one does not need to know how to make it. This is the critical guy, the guy who's critiquing the theory. He says this proposition will be understood to express the essential message of the theory, that absolute ignorance is fully qualified to take the place of absolute wisdom in all the achievements of creative skill. And what Dennett's reply to that is exactly. Darwin's strange inversion of reasoning was in fact a new and wonderful way of thinking. I mean, the idea, that's okay, and Darwin's Dangerous Idea, he goes on. This is a philosopher now, mind you. He says, if God created and designed all these wonderful things, who created God? Super God? And who created super God? Super duper God? Okay, so he's just mocking. That's not an argument. That's just sarcasm and ridicule. River Out of Eden, Richard Dawkins. He's another one of the famous, the four horsemen of the anti-theist movement of some years ago. And this is his book from River Out of Eden. He says, the illusion of purpose is so powerful that biologists themselves, even biologists, use the assumption of good design as a working tool. All right, so there is no real purpose. There is no real design, but it looks like it, so we'll pretend that it's there to figure out how things work. Does that sound logical to you or rational to you? He goes on to say in this book that the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. That's a materialist picture of the universe. In The God Delusion, which he wrote a few years later, he goes on to say this about God. The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction, jealous and proud of it, petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. Well, I just thought he said there's no evil and no good in the universe. That's what we'd expect, right? And then what does he do? He's talking about evil and good here, right? Okay, so you can't have it both ways. You can't, and be intellectually honest. Or you can't pick and choose between your worldviews. You can't take some of the Christian worldview and some of the, you can't do that. You can't mix, you need to pick a side and get on it and stay on it. And try to be intellectually consistent within that. In River Out of Eden, this is another one of my favorite ones, he says evolution is very possibly not, in actual fact, always gradual, all right? It's not always gradual, but it has to be gradual when you use it to explain the coming into existence of complicated and, again, apparently designed object like eyes. So it's not always gradual, but it has to be gradual when we use it to explain things, right? The blind watchmaker, he says, how's this for science? We could accept a certain amount of luck in our explanation, but not too much. The question is how much? In Life Itself, this was written by Francis Crick, one of the co-discoverers of the structure of the DNA molecule. He says, I myself, like many scientists, believe that the soul is imaginary and that what we call our minds is simply a way of talking about the functions of our brains. The Lucretian Swerve. This is about free will. This is Anthony Cashmore wrote an article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences maybe 10 years ago. I was struck by this. He says the reality is, not only do we have no more free will than a fly or a bacterium, in actuality, we have no more free will than a bowl of sugar. The laws of nature are uniform throughout, and these laws do not accommodate the concept of free will. Now, he's right about that. If you're talking about the laws of nature accommodating free will, they do not. However, the laws of nature are not the only laws that are out there, as we'll see. There's also an intellectual law and a moral law, all right? So, but that's the conclusion, that there's no free will. The Atheist's Guide to Reality, this was written by, I'll think of his name in a minute. He was the head of the philosophy department at Duke University, Alex Rosenberg. And in the Atheist's Guide to Reality, he says, is there a God? No. What's the purpose of the universe? There is none. What's the meaning of life? There is none. Is there a soul that is immortal? No. Is there free will? No way. What's the difference between right and wrong, good and bad? There's no moral difference between them. Abortion, euthanasia, suicide, paying taxes, foreign aid, anything else you don't like, forbidden, permissible, anything goes. Well, you know, that's what they say. You can't live like that. Nobody can live like that, not even them. But there's an intellectual, I would call it degeneracy there. But okay, the problem of the soul. This is Owen Flanagan. He worked he was a philosophy professor at Duke University. He says there are no such things as souls or non-physical minds. Humans don't possess animal parts or instincts. We are animals. Many think the conflict lies in our resistance to materialism, physicalism, naturalism, call it what you will. We are, I repeat, animals. And many religious people resist the framework of Darwinian evolution because they can't accept that we're just animals. All right? That's why we don't like evolution, because we think we're more than animals. Not because it's utter nonsense, but because we think we're animals. And because they think humans have souls. Okay? So how do we know? I'm going to talk you through how I've come to see things, and it begins in observation and sensation. And then we use reason and logic to abstract general principles from what we see. And so we're going to start at the very beginning. We're going to start at the very beginning with a truth claim that nobody can argue with. all right? And we're going to go from there and see what happens. So the beginning truth claim is that things exist, right? There's things, there's stuff, there's a universe, all right? Can anybody disagree with that? Okay, so far so good. So what do we observe about these things? The first thing we observe as we look around is that everything is what it is, right? And if you think about it, it's impossible for it to be otherwise. If something exists, it is what it is. And that's called, in logic, the law of identity. It's the foundational rule or principle or law for rational thought. It's the law of identity. And where else do we find the law of identity in the Bible? In Exodus 3:14, Moses is at the burning bush. The Lord is saying, go down to Egypt and lead my people out. And he says, who should I tell them? Send me. And what is the answer? You know the answer. I am who I am. Tell them I am sent you. That's the law of identity. I am who I am. All right? Interesting, I thought. Okay, the second thing we observe is that things are not something else at the same time. In other words, to be what you are is not to be something else. And that's called the law of non-contradiction. You can't be what you are and be something else. It's impossible. That's the law of non-contradiction. That's the second law of logic. The third law is the law of excluded middle. There's no in between, being and non-being. There's nothing in the middle. Okay, there is or isn't, all right? And then there's a reason why things are. All right? There's a reason why things are, and a clue to that is that they change. And the last thing that we observe for right now is that only things have causal power. In other words, as a prerequisite for being able to have causal power, for being able to do anything, first you have to exist. Does that make sense? Okay, if I wasn't here, if I didn't exist, then I couldn't be talking to you. If you didn't exist, then you couldn't be listening to me. If my car didn't exist, I couldn't be driving it to Dallas after. Okay, we get that. We get that. Only things have causal power. Okay, now concerning matter, let's talk about matter for a second. Matter is sensible, it's measurable, it's somewhere in the universe. Material, it's somewhere. It changes. We see that from observation. It's finite and limited. The first and second laws of thermodynamics tell us that. Now, I was talking to an engineer friend the other day. We were playing tennis and in Houston and stopped in Houston on our way to see some friends. And he said, well, are you going to be around? I said, no, I'm going to Austin to give a talk. And then I shut up because they always say, well, what are you going to talk about? And he says, what are you going to talk about? I said, I'm going to talk about proofs for the existence of God from nature. Oh, and I said, well, for example, let me try one on for you. I said, as a characteristic of matter, you're an engineer, so you're a very scientific engineer, logical, rational guy. Have you ever read or ever seen in an article or heard in a lecture or read in a book or heard that matter can create itself? And he said, well, no, of course not. I said, yeah, here we are. I said, in Texas, that's what we call a clue. Okay? And he had this kind of a shocked look on his face, and he'd never, done that math. Any scientist, and I'm sure there's scientists in here, and correct me if I'm wrong, no scientist would ever tell you that matter can create matter, because it goes against this first law of thermodynamics, one of the most certain laws of all the scientific laws. So if matter can't create matter, but matter's here, then something else did it. Right? Okay. Matter is described by physical and chemical laws. And this will come into play in a second when we talk about souls. And matter's a solid, liquid, or gas. It has mass, can be converted to energy, and it exists only in the present. So if we were just matter, and we just existed in the present, as matter does, we couldn't know about the past or the future. But we do know about the past and the future. So there's something more than matter going on. And I'll make a better argument than that later on, but that's just something that occurred to me. Okay, so what can matter not do? Matter can arrange itself into symbols and create rules, in other words, language. All languages are symbols and rules. Matter can't reason. Matter can't choose. Matter can't initiate communication. Matter can't tell right from wrong. Matter can't create itself or animate itself. I mean, not only are these people saying that matter somehow created itself, but it animated itself. It made itself alive. Now, souls operate under different rules than matter. If you look at if you go to the football game, you see they're playing on a field that's 100 yards by 52 or 53 yards wide, and there's end zones and goalposts, and you have 4 chances to make a first down, and so on and so forth. If you go to a baseball game, you know you're at a baseball game because they're following different rules. There's bases, and you score runs differently, and you have 3 outs to a side in an inning, 6 outs total in an inning. And so they're following different rules. That's how you know there's something different going on, right? Well, our brains follow brain chemistry. Do they not? I mean, yeah, sure. The synapses and the neurotransmitters, that's all brain chemistry. But there's more to it than that, because our thinking follows the laws of logic. And our moral law that's written on our hearts, we follow a different law. So there's 2 different things going on here. There's different laws. Our thought follows the laws of logic and morality, and our brain chemistry is the laws of physics. So they're different. So we do have a soul, because matter can't do any of these things. And so when somebody stands up and says that we don't have souls, they're wrong. I'll just leave it at that. Okay, so let's have an argument, our first argument for the existence of God. And this is based on, remember, we agreed to this, that matter can't create itself, that existence is a prerequisite to having any causal power, all right? So if there was ever nothing, and I was debating a guy one time, he's got a big, it was an internet thing, and he's got a huge audience. He says he does. I don't know if he does or not. And I was making this argument with him, and I said, if there was ever nothing, and he goes, well, what's nothing? And I laughed, and he took offense to that. And I said, well, nothing is no matter, no energy, no existence, no capabilities, no possibilities, no potential, nothing, okay? So if there ever existed a state of nothingness, what would there still be? This is the audience participation part. Nothing, okay? But there is something. So there never has been nothing. A being has always existed. Now, that's a modus tollens form of argument, and it goes, if this is true, then that's true. But that's not true, so this is not true. That's a valid form of argument. And these premises are true. If there was ever nothing, there'd still be nothing. But there is something, so there's never been nothing. That's how the logic works. So a being has always existed. So that question, the philosophy 101 question of, why is there anything at all rather than nothing? Well, because a being's always existed. God's always existed. That's why. All right, I mentioned earlier that things change. That's a clue for causation. And remember that the prerequisite for causation is being. Now, there had to be a first cause. And let me flip forward to this slide for a second. Apologies to the Lord for this. Representing him as the finger. But we see the dominoes here, and they're standing up straight. Now, if we go to the end of the dominoes, and the dominoes are falling down, all right, and we come back, we would infer that somebody had done that, right? There had been a first cause to this chain of events. If there was no first cause, there would be no subsequent causes. Are we tracking with that? But there are subsequent causes. I mean, we look around all over the place. There has to be a first cause. Because if there was no first cause, there would be no subsequent causes. So the first cause, what do we know about the first cause? Could it be caused by something else? Well, no, because then it wouldn't be first. But there has to be a first. So the first cause is uncaused. Now, what does it mean to be uncaused? It means to be eternal. It means to be immaterial. It means to be necessary. It means that its very nature is to be. I am who I am. Okay? Again, only beings have causal power. And the cosmological argument, and you're all well familiar with this, and it goes like this. Everything that begins to exist has a cause of its existence. Again, indisputable. If it begins to exist, something caused it to exist. Because nothing can cause something else to exist. It has a cause of its existence. The universe began to exist. Philosophy and science tell us that. Therefore, the universe has a cause of its existence, which is outside of itself. That's undeniable. And if you want to argue with the conclusion, then you have to tell me that something can begin out of nothing, or that the universe is eternal. And then I say, well, what about the second law of thermodynamics? The universe is tending toward disorder. It's, the heat's running out. And if the universe was eternally old, all the stars would be burned up by now and we'd all be dead. We wouldn't be here, but we're not. Okay, so the universe isn't eternally old. It had a beginning. All right. And well, you can't say that. Yeah, I can't. I just did. So what about an infinite regress? Sometimes they want to hide an infinite regress. First of all, there's no such thing as an infinite regress because we live in a finite universe. So you don't have something that's infinite within the finitude of the universe. And if you're counting a regress of causes, you can't ever count to the end. So there's no infinite cause there. It's a series of finite causes. And it has zero explanatory power anyway. So let's say that being is a 1 and non-being is 0. And I'm a 0 until my parents come along, right? Now I'm a 1 because I got my being from someone else, right? And we can run that back and back and back. Well, let's say there is possible to have an infinite regress of causes. How many zeros does it take to add up to 1? I mean, you could have an infinite number of zeros. You still don't have a 1, okay? So there's no explanatory power in that cause. And think of it this way. I've got an iPhone here, and let's say that in this scenario, I asked my buddy Dwayne. I said, Dwayne, can I borrow your iPhone? He goes, I don't have one. So he turns to Carol, he says, can I borrow your? She says she doesn't have one. And we go to Roger, and we go to Nick, and we go to John, we go to Lacey, we go back forever and ever and ever. And nobody has an iPhone. We go back forever. Nobody has an iPhone. Is it possible for me to have an iPhone? If no one has one to give to me? Okay, audience participation again. The answer is no. All right? So same scenario, only this time I have an iPhone. So what do we know? We know that somebody in the past had an iPhone, okay, to pass forward to give to me. Well, in the same way, we know that somebody in the past had being who didn't need to get being from someone else, who was being, who was I am, who I am, okay? So the infinite regress, somebody tries to pull that one on you, doesn't work. Yes.
That also speaks to the slide earlier about, where did God come from, super God, and those kind of
Right.
things.
Yeah. And that a philosopher would say things like that. That's really embarrassing, actually. They all say things that are embarrassing. Okay, now, I talked about earlier about the laws of logic. That's a thinking thing, and the moral law. Now, everybody knows that there's a moral law, right? We all know that. You can say there isn't one, but you can't live that out. You can't act like that. And how do I know when I've been wronged? Well, I don't know about you, but my first reaction is sort of to sometimes get angry, right? I mean, somebody's to cut me off in traffic. My first instinct is not to pray for them. I mean, they might be on their way to, an emergency or something. But, my first instinct is, I'm angry. When I'm wrong, I'm remorseful. Okay, and the same with you. So we all know that. Now, the interesting thing about the moral law is that it transcends and it's immanent in space and time. So, for example, let's think about this for a second, thought experiment. If I go back 1,000,000 years ago and I commit murder, is it wrong then? I mean, does the passage of time, either to the past or the future, does that have any impact on whether it's still wrong? No. What if I do it here or I do it on the moon? Does that matter where I do it? No. So the moral law transcends space and time, which we might expect, being as how the moral law is grounded in the nature and essence of God. And that's where it comes from. And it's put on our hearts. So we all know it's there. And Alex Rosenberg can say, anything goes. Well, if I walked into his office and just punched him in the face and put a gun to his head and said, give me a PhD, do you think he'd think that something was wrong with that? Of course he would. I mean, okay. And some people would say, sociopaths don't know right from wrong. I say, yeah, they do. Wrong them. see how far they just don't care, all right? So here's the moral law argument. And it's the same basic argument. A moral law requires a moral lawgiver. There has to be a source for the moral law. There is a moral law, so there is a moral lawgiver, all right? Sometimes the problem of evil gets thrown up in our faces, right? And this is a toughie, I'll grant you that, because evil is hurtful, it's painful, it's difficult, and it doesn't particularly lend itself to rational explanation. Somebody's just lost their spouse or lost a child. They don't really need a logical argument at that point, do they? Nevertheless, we have to explain it, because the argument goes, if God was all good and God was all powerful, then there'd be no evil. But there is evil, so God's either not all good or he's not all powerful. All right? Well, how do we deal with that? Well, evil's not a thing in itself. It's not the opposite of good. It's a corruption of good. Like rust is a corruption of iron. All right? If you had no iron, then you don't have any rust, right? So evil is a corruption of good. Good is the existent thing. So God looked at his creation and said it was good. Evil is a corruption of that good. Now, love requires free will. And free will makes evil possible. Because if we were just all robots, like they say, then you might as well be married to R2-D2 or C-3PO or whatever. Those are Star Wars references, by the way. You see what I'm saying? I mean, I can't force my wife to love me. God can't force us to love him. He can draw us and pull us. And I like to say he doesn't give us free will, he gives us free won't. We can say no to him, but he's pulling everybody. Jesus said, if I be lifted up, will draw all men to myself. Paul says to Timothy, this is good and acceptable in the sight of God our Savior, that all men come to a knowledge of the truth. All right? 1 John 2:2, Jesus died for not only our sins, but the sins of everybody. Okay, so he's pulling all of us, so why aren't we all saved? Well, we have the ability to say no. I got my own agenda. I don't want to listen to you. I don't, whatever. That's not my agenda, so I can't really, I can't understand that wholly. Do you remember the name Christopher Hitchens? He was another one of the 4 big atheists, Dennett, Hitchens, Sam Harris, and Richard Dawkins. Well, Christopher Hitchens died several years ago in Houston, actually. And he was said on his, his deathbed or near his deathbed, that if he had some sort of a last-second deathbed conversion, that it was the drugs speaking, because he would not submit. Well, that's not an atheist. That's not a guy that doesn't believe in God. That's a guy who's angry at God. That's a guy who rejects God. Because I won't submit to whom? Nothing? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. So he knew, and I mean, that's just a terrifying thought for me. I mean, it literally sends chills down my spine that somebody could, say that. So, and somebody might say, well, why does love have to require free will? Well, it's by definition, okay? And God can't do anything that's irrational because he's rational. There are a lot of things God can't do. He can't die, he can't lie, he can't commit sin, he can't, and he can't create an uncreated being, all right? Because that would violate laws of rationality, which are his essence, okay? So think about this. If God wanted to have creatures with whom he could have a relationship, but he couldn't create uncreated beings, he can only create created beings, then for him to have a relationship with us, since we can't be like him, he would have to be like us. Jesus would have to become human. And so we can relate to Jesus because he's a human. All right? He at some point, he could be sitting in that chair right there. Okay? It's not some imaginary or abstract proposition. He's a real, and that's how we have, I think, a relationship with God that makes sense and it can be understood. It's because of Jesus, the person of Jesus. Okay, design exists. And what do we mean by design? Well, in sort of the broadest sense, we adapt means to ends. We purposely arrange parts. And often we use different materials, plastic, metal, wood, whatever. And there's two ideas to this. And being a Hugh Ross ministry, we all understand the fine-tuning argument of the universe. That's called the anthropic principle. And also DNA. And I've got a well, before I do that, I've got a couple of slides to see if we can detect design or not. Because, people say there is no design, but does anybody see the difference between those two pictures? Yeah, I thought so. Here's the beach. Oh, that's not design. I mean, that's just an accident. That's the wind and the waves made that. This is a volcanic cloud eruption. This is my favorite one. You can see the Wicked Witch of the West up there on top of the Y, that little, Yeah, so if you see this, okay, natural laws can explain that. If you see this, you know that the Wicked Witch of the West has been flying around, okay? Because there's letters, there's language, there's design. Go to YouTube and search on cell biology or biochemistry of the cell or something like that, and you will see it's incredible what's going on inside of a cell, every cell in our body all the time. Unbeknownst to us, not being driven by us, or, and these are little machines, nanomachines. And this structure right here, these are called microtubules. And they assemble themselves and disassemble themselves to move to these little machines, carry things from one part of the cell to the other part of the cell where they're needed. And then when that cell gets there, and this shows the unraveling and the duplication of DNA.
What I am going to show you are the astonishing molecular machines that create the living fabric of your body. Now, molecules are really, really tiny. And by tiny, I mean really. They're smaller than the wavelength of light, so we have no way to directly observe them. But through science, we do have a fairly good idea of what's going on down at the molecular scale. So what we can do is actually tell you about the molecules, but we don't really have a direct way of showing you the molecules. One way around this is to draw pictures. And this idea is actually nothing new. Scientists have always created pictures as part of their thinking and discovery process. They draw pictures of what they're observing with their eyes through technology like telescopes and microscopes, and also what they're thinking about in their minds. I picked two well-known examples because they're very well known for expressing science through art. And I start with Galileo, who used the world's first telescope to look at the moon. And he transformed our understanding of the moon. The perception of the 17th century was the moon was a perfect heavenly sphere. But what Galileo saw was a rocky, barren world, which he expressed through his watercolor painting. Another scientist with very big ideas, the superstar of biology, is Charles Darwin. And with this famous entry in his notebook, he begins in the top left-hand corner with, "I think," and then sketches out the first tree of life, which is his perception of how all the species, all living things on Earth are connected through evolutionary history, the origin of species through natural selection and divergence from an ancestral population. Even as a scientist, I used to go to lectures by molecular biologists and find them completely incomprehensible with all the fancy technical language and jargon that they would use in describing their work, until I encountered the artworks of David Goodsell, who was a molecular biologist at the Scripps Institute. And his pictures are all, everything's accurate, it's all to scale. And his work illuminated for me what the molecular world inside us is like. So this is a transection through blood. In the top left-hand corner, you've got this yellow-green area. The yellow-green area is the fluids of blood, which is mostly water, but it's also antibodies, sugars, hormones, that kind of thing. And the red region is a slice into a red blood cell, and those red molecules are hemoglobin. They are actually red. That's what gives blood its color. And hemoglobin acts as a molecular sponge to soak up the oxygen in your lungs and then carry it to other parts of the body. I was very much inspired by this image many years ago, and I wondered whether we could use computer graphics to represent the molecular world. What would it look like? And that's how I really began. So let's begin. This is DNA in its classic double helix form, and it's from X-ray crystallography, so it's an accurate model of DNA. If we unwind the double helix and unzip the two strands, you see these things that look like teeth. Those are the letters of genetic code, the 25,000 genes you've got written in your DNA. This is what they typically talk about, the genetic code. This is what they're talking about. But I want to talk about a different aspect of DNA science, and that is the physical nature of DNA. And it's these two strands that run in opposite directions for reasons I can't go into right now, but they physically run in opposite directions, which creates a number of complications for your living cells, as you're about to see, most particularly when DNA is being copied. And so what I'm about to show you is an accurate representation of the actual DNA replication machine that's occurring right now inside your body, at least 2002 biology. So DNA is entering the production line from the left-hand side, and it hits this collection, this miniature biochemical machines that are pulling apart the DNA strand and making an exact copy. So DNA comes in, it hits this blue donut-shaped structure, and it's ripped apart into its two strands. One strand can be copied directly, and it can be seen spooling off down to the bottom there. But things aren't so simple for the other strand because it must be copied backwards. So it's thrown out repeatedly in these loops and copied one section at a time, creating 2 new DNA molecules. Now, you have billions of this machine right now whirring away inside you, copying your DNA with exquisite fidelity. It's an accurate representation, and it's pretty much at the correct speed for what it's occurring inside you. But I've left out error correction and a bunch of other things. This was work from a number of years ago. Thank you. This is work from a number of years ago, but what I want to show you next is updated science. It's updated technology. So again, we begin with DNA, and it's jiggling and wiggling there because of the surrounding supermolecules, which I've stripped away so you can see something. DNA is about 2 nanometers across, which is really quite tiny. But in each one of your cells, each strand of DNA is about 30 to 40 million nanometers long. So to keep the DNA organized, to regulate access to the genetic code, it's wrapped around these purple proteins. I've labeled them purple here. It's packaged up and bundled up. All of its field of view is a single strand of DNA. This huge package of DNA is called a chromosome, and we'll come back to chromosomes in a minute. We're pulling out, we're zooming out through a nuclear pore, which is sort of the gateway to this compartment that holds all the DNA called the nucleus. All of this field of view is about a semester's worth of biology, and I've got 7 minutes, so we're not going to be able to do that today. No, I'm being told no. This is the way a living cell looks down a light microscope, and it's been filmed under time-lapse, which is why you can see it moving. The nuclear envelope breaks down. These sausage-shaped things are the chromosomes, and we'll focus on them. They go through this very striking motion that is focused on these little red spots. When the cell feels it's ready to go, it rips apart the chromosome. One set of DNA goes to one side, the other side gets the other set of DNA, identical copies of DNA, and then the cell splits down the middle. And again, you have billions of cells undergoing this process right now inside of you. Now we're going to rewind and just focus on the chromosomes and look at its structure and describe it. So again, here we are at that equator moment. The chromosomes line up, and if we isolate just one chromosome, we're going to pull it out and have a look at its structure. So this is one of the biggest molecular structures that you have, at least as far as we've discovered so far, inside of us. So this is a single chromosome, and you have 2 strands of DNA in each chromosome. One is bundled up into one sausage, the other strand is bundled up into the other sausage. These things that look like whiskers that are sticking out from either side are the dynamic scaffolding of the cell. They're called microtubules, but name's not so important. But what we're going to focus on is this red region. I've labeled it red here, and it's the interface between the dynamic scaffolding and the chromosomes. It is obviously central to the movement of the chromosomes. We have no idea really, as to how it's achieving that movement. We've been studying this thing called the kinetochore for over 100 years with intense study, and we're still just beginning to discover what it's all about. It is made up of about 200 different types of proteins, thousands of proteins in total. It is a signal broadcasting system. It broadcasts through chemical signals, telling the rest of the cell when it's ready, when it feels that everything is aligned and ready to go for the separation of the chromosomes. It is able to couple onto the growing and shrinking microtubules. It's transiently, it's involved with the growing of the microtubules, and it's able to transiently couple onto them. It's also a tension sensing system. It's able to feel when the cell is ready, when the chromosome is correctly positioned. It's turning green here because it feels that everything is just right. And you'll see that there's one little last bit that's still remaining red. And it's walked away down the microtubules. That is the signal broadcasting system sending out the stop signal, and it's walked away. I mean, it's that mechanical. It's molecular clockwork. This is how you work at the molecular scale. So with a little bit of molecular eye candy, we've got kinesins, which are the orange ones. They're little molecular courier molecules walking one way. And here are the dynein. They're carrying that broadcasting system, and they've got their long legs so they can step around obstacles and so on. So again, this is all derived accurately from the science. The problem is we can't show it to you any other way. Exploring at the frontier of science, at the frontier of human understanding, is mind-blowing. Discovering this stuff is certainly a pleasurable incentive to work in science. But most medical researchers, this is just discovering this stuff is simply steps along the path to the big goals, which are to eradicate disease, to eliminate the suffering and the misery that disease causes, and to lift people out of poverty. Thank you.
Isn't that incredibly remarkable? Those little machines that you can't see with the naked eye, that's going on. And he said the cell feels like it's time to divide. How does the cell know when it's time to divide? But it's an accident? There's no design in that? Stop. All right? I mean, okay, so the design argument. Again, every design has a designer. I mean, that's true by definition. You can't have a design unless you have a designer. The universe and life are clearly designed. So the universe and life have a designer and an origin. Can atheism explain any of this? No. What they do, and if you read them, I'm going to buy that book, and I'm going to read it, and I'm going to send you a critique of it. Atheism just denies the existence of those things. Now, there's no moral law. There's no souls. There's no design. There's no purpose. There's no point. Okay? Well, where do we all come from? Infinite regress. They've got nothing that's rational, that's logical. And so, atheism is, morally and intellectually bankrupt. It's morally bankrupt because they reject the idea of a moral law. Well, there you go. If there's no right and wrong, I'd say that's morally bankrupt. And somebody might say, well, atheists could be good people. Atheists can do good things. I'd say, yeah, they can. Given their worldview, they have no reason to. Okay? Really, right? And the reason that they do is because it's imprinted on their heart. They can't get away from it. And it's intellectually bankrupt because it rejects the laws of logic. You can't say that there's no good and no evil in the universe and then turn around and say God's evil. Can't do that. Doesn't work. All right? So the God of the Bible exists and explains everything that we see. And whether you look up at the stars at night, like with Ed, or you look down at the microscopic level in the cell and see the incredible machinery that's going on, or you look inside at your heart, you see God everywhere. You can't get away. You can't get... Bertrand Russell, he's a famous atheist from the early 20th century. And somebody asked him, he said, well, Bertrand, what if you get to heaven and there's a God? And he says, why didn't you believe in me? And Bertrand said, well, I would say that he didn't show me enough evidence. Dude, everything that you see is evidence of the Creator. Because without the Creator, there'd be nothing. Okay, but there is something, so there's a Creator. That's how the logic works. So Romans 1, 18 through 22, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth and unrighteousness. I think this is an interesting phrase. Notice that he doesn't say they don't know the truth. All right? They suppress the truth. People know. Everybody know, and that's the title of my talk, what we can't not know. Everybody knows this. All right? Because that which is known about God is evident within them, moral law, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. So that's what I've tried to explain, expand that verse out and show you how that works, rationally and logically, from what's been made, that there's a maker and a designer and so on. For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculation, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools. So that's a really sad thing. Because You can't disagree with any of this and be rational, right? Because if you're going to disagree, you have to say that, first thing you have to say is that nothing could create things. Well, who's ever seen that? And these are the people that are saying that they're scientific and that they're rational and that they're intellectuals and that we're not. When exactly the reverse is true. It's a very intellectual, rational thing to believe in God and Christ. And it's very irrational and foolish to reject him. Please don't do that. Okay, that's the talk.
You got time for Q&A?
Absolutely.
All right, excellent. Thank you. You and I were talking earlier that I'm taking a philosophy course right now. One of the interesting things that the professor stated was that there are no undisputed philosophical facts. So,
is that an undisputed philosophical fact?
that's a good question. So, my question, and I asked him, I said, well, does that include, I think, therefore I am, from Descartes, which almost everyone agrees to? And he says, surprisingly, yes. Now, he said he doesn't agree with that statement. But his point being is that there are, whatever the fact is, there seem to be philosophers who are willing to dispute it.
Oh, absolutely.
So my question,
Yes, okay.
okay, as you mentioned before, atheism that we're against, but the atheist we're trying to reach. So
Exactly.
when you are speaking to someone who seems intent on denying what appears to be a philosophical fact, how do you lovingly and respectfully and gently engage them in that conversation?
Well, I don't do that.
Did I ask the wrong person?
Yeah. Okay, see, I have these two sides to me. I have this Marine Corps side, infantry officer, and I have this Christian side. Okay? And there's a constant war going on. No, I just try to come back to the question, back to the. See, you get in trouble if you argue about conclusions. All right, the argument's not about conclusions. You have to go back to the premises. And so I will say, so what you're really telling me is that nothing can create something? I mean, is that what you're saying? Am I hearing you right? And then shut up and let them try to stumble around and listen. And sometimes, I mean, they're just not gonna. And so I came to, at some point along the line, to realize that it wasn't my job to convince them. That's the Holy Spirit's job, right? My job is just to lovingly, gently, respectfully lay out the truth and back off. So I don't try to do that. I don't try to, pound the square peg into the round hole. But I will. You mentioned Descartes.
Yes.
He says, "I think, therefore I am." See, he left out a step. The way it should go is, I am, therefore I think, therefore I know that I am. Okay, because there's two sides of philosophy. There's the being side and there's the knowing side. The being side of metaphysics is called ontology, and the knowing side is called epistemology. All right, so there's two parts. And it's also interesting that in the Bible, God is the I am in Leviticus 3:14, and Jesus is the Logos, the knowing, in John 1:1. All right? So I just find that as another interesting, kind of cool, thing. Yes, sir.
The cell can replicate itself, right? In fact, there's trillions of cells we have in our body. Many of them are replicating all the time. Has man been able to create a machine that replicates itself?
Not that I know of. In fact, one of my, when somebody tells me that this could, that we could, just how absurd this is, to say that we're just accidents, and natural selection, and natural selection. What does natural selection mean? It means those that are more fit or fitter or the fittest survive, right? And duplicate or reproduce. Well, how do you know which ones are the fittest? Well, they're the ones that are alive, right? Are they not? I mean, because by definition, we just say they're living, so they're fit. Well, how do you define those that are alive? Well, they must be the fittest. I mean, natural selection just means you're alive. I mean, that's some sort of a power or a force is ludicrous. But I'm like, well, science can't even make a cell. Make a fly, make a bug, make something that'll, recreate itself, duplicate itself. You can't. I mean, and the more science advances, this is another interesting thing, the more science advances, the worse it gets for them. Okay? It doesn't get better, it gets worse because you go, can you believe this? I mean, I thought 400 billion galaxies was huge. Now you're telling me there may be 2 trillion? We can't have, and look in a cell, that's going on, all according to certain laws and language that we have the very tiniest understanding. And of what we see in the universe, I just saw this in Brian Green the other day. I was watching a YouTube video. He's a physicist. And he was talking about the multiverse. That he was trying to say that, well, everybody realizes that the laws of physics are, and the initial constants and are very, very finely tuned so that life can exist. But, and that would be odd if there was just one universe. But, there could be an infinite number of universes. And then in which case we just find ourselves. And what he's just done is okay, you can't account for this one. Now you're going to account for an infinite number of universes? How do you account for that? I mean, he thinks that's rational. And he says, well, if you go into a department store and you're just trying a suit and it fits, well, you think that's odd. But if you got a whole rack of suits and a sales clerk hands you one and it fits, well, then the sales clerk would be like God, right? I mean, there's more going on. Their philosophical chops are awful. Yeah.
So real quick, you're just talking about how irrational it is
Mhm.
to be an atheist. And I know a couple of really smart, intelligent people in my life that are atheists.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to figure out, and I just, other than them being spiritually blinded,
Mm-hmm.
what it is that kind of on an emotional level maybe, in just different people's experience, what if there's something driving them kind of on an emotional level to believe in atheism? It's just, if you could speculate on that.
I will speculate on that. Thank you for the question. And this is just speculation. I think that they're atheists first. Seems to me that they've suffered some sort of evil. Spouse has left them, child has died, lost their job, a career, something like that. Why would God let this happen to me? All right, like that. Somebody's taken advantage of them in a church. All right, Christians cheated them on a business deal. Okay, that's probably one of the big reasons. I think another reason is because maybe younger people think it's hip, to be an intellectual, to be counted as an intellectual, to be different. I'm an atheist. The flying spaghetti monster. That's all ridiculous. But I don't get it. Think about Satan. All right. Who? He rejected. He said, I'll be like the Most High. Well, sure. And he's a smart guy. What else was I going to? The Pharisees in Matthew 12. Jesus is in the temple, and he liked to do this on the Sabbath. He liked to tweak the Pharisees on the Sabbath of the temples. He's arguing with them about whether it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath. And there's a guy standing there with a withered hand, and the Pharisees are resisting him, and he tells the guy with the withered hand to stretch out your hand. Stretches out his hand, he's healed. And what's their reaction? They went outside and plot to destroy him. I mean, I don't get that. And I just don't. So, what I try to do is I try to say, look, you might think you're being an atheist for rational reasons or for intellectual reasons, but you're not, okay? I'm trying to take that away from them. You know, and then it's not my business anymore, except to be kind and, you know, and loving and that. Yes, Nick.
Hi, Tom. This is a logic and philosophical question. How do you deal with two phenomena that I see happening now? The first is a redefinition of terms. So, for example, what's nothing is now being redefined.
Something.
Perhaps as a like quantum vacuum.
Right.
Okay. The second thing is where they're playing word games, typically where they take the word and its inverse and they combine them. So you have a married bachelor, or you have dry
Right.
wetness, or finite infinity, and use that as a sort of way of proving that God, you know, can God create the immovable, you know, create a rock he can't move type of thing. So what is the philosophical, logical, rational?
They're violating the law of identity. The thing is what it is. It's like the Buddhist thing, you know, one hand clapping, right? Well, clapping, you know, involves two hands. So if you say one hand clapping, that's a contradiction in terms. That's like saying square circle. And God can't do that. God can't make a square circle because the law of identity is grounded in the nature of God. Things are what they are. Now they could play the word games, and the other thing is they're doing is equivocating. In Isaiah 5:20, Isaiah says, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil." What is that? That's a violation of the law of identity, because evil is evil, and good is good. And if you call evil good, you've violated the law of identity. You've transgressed against the intellectual law, the rational law, which is every bit a part of the nature of God as the moral law. Okay? And in Romans 1, they suppress the truth in unrighteousness. So rejection of the truth is not just an intellectual thing, it's a moral thing. If you tell a lie, that's wrong. Because it's not, you know, that's what I would say. And before I forget, going back to your philosophy professor saying that there are no certain philosophical truths or something like that.
No undisputed philosophical facts.
No undisputed philosophical facts. I would say, is that an undisputed philosophical fact? Okay, he just contradicted himself. All right? I was arguing with a guy one time who said, nothing is certain in this world. And I said, are you certain about that? You know, are you sure about that? I mean, and the guy couldn't get it. I mean, he said, no, there's nothing certain. I said, are you sure? You can't escape. You know. Yes, sir. Oh, I'm sorry.
Right at the beginning, you were mentioning an author, I can't remember his name, but you said that he pointed to some of the evils in the world, misogyny, homophobia,
Yeah.
those sort of things, as part of the intellectual argument against God. And you pointed out rightly, I believe, that you can't have it both ways.
Right.
I agree, but wouldn't it be more accurate to say that your personal philosophy doesn't argue one way or the other against the existence or non-existence of God? That's just your philosophy. In which case, it becomes a groupthink situation. If I can convince others that my way is moral, so much the better.
Well, yeah, but again, going back to attacking the assumptions, why do you say that's moral? Why do you say that? I mean, because there has to be a reason. There has to be a law that transcends. Otherwise, it's just, it then devolves into a matter, if the moral law doesn't govern what's right and wrong, then what ultimately does is violence. Whoever's got the most violence, whoever's got the most guns or the biggest cannons or whatever, I'm right. If you say I'm wrong, I shoot you.
Might makes right.
Might makes right, okay? So you either have this moral law, and now we might disagree about what that is from time to time, or we might not know what exactly the right thing is to do, but there is one, okay? So I had people ask me about that. Well, it's an evolution. It's a good thing for people to, to thrive and prosper. And I say, why? I mean, the Nazis were Darwinists. They were trying to create a master race. Darwin was huge in Germany in the late 18th, 19th century and early 20th century. I mean, they had a reason for doing what they did. Right? It was evil, but, they're just following. I mean, if Dawkins is right, if there's no good, there is no evil, well then, who's to say that killing 6 million Jews is a bad thing? Why do you say that? Well, because there's a moral law that's based in the nature of our Creator. That's why. And you're destroying people that are created in His image. That's why. And if you want some meaning and definition in your life, I could also say, not only that I'm created in the image of God, I could say, and each one of us could say, hi, I'm Tom. Jesus couldn't be here today, so He sent me. Well, think about that. I do. And I fail miserably, like on a minute-by-minute basis, I think. But every interaction that I have with another human being that's created in the image of God, that Jesus died to save him, I'm supposed to represent the Lord to that person. It almost makes me weep to say that because I know how horribly I do that. A lot of the time or some of the time or, most of that, whatever. He'll be the judge someday of that. Yes, sir.
A long time ago, I read a science fiction short story, regarding anything that can create itself.
Uh-huh.
It was an environmental science fiction horror story that they decades ago, they predicted nano machines, and so we had these rockets that would go and prepare planets for people, and nano machines would mine the materials, build a bigger factory. So I'm sure that there's a lot of hubris that we could do that. But I'm thinking more what's actually missing with the materialist view, because I think C.S. Lewis also predicted that we were going to claim to create or at least maintain life when he had the disembodied head with the pumps and the bellows keeping it alive, and they thought that the person was thinking, but it was channeling Satan. And now I'm thinking of the transhumanists that want to upload their personality into a machine, and my first thought is, well, then we'll have an ugly narcissist machine that acts bad like you do. But I'm just thinking that the atheists may not want. See, we claim, and I was looking for evidence that it's here, that we claim that we aren't Christian unless the Spirit indwells us. So we're looking for a source of animation from outside of us, and that means that we have a little humility. So I'm thinking, is it possible that the atheist doesn't want to accept any influence from outside? But then that means the New Ager, they want the whole cosmic one to influence them, and it's, a God of power is like their fathers didn't know. They want the whole one to be influenced, so they're actually inviting a power that's impersonal, that's not God. So to me, it seems like there's two kinds of people, and maybe the atheist is more hardcore because they don't want any influence from the outside. They don't want to think they need a Holy Spirit. And then you got, like my cousin who follows a guru, she thinks the cosmic whole is talking to her. So I'm just, my question is, what's actually missing in an atheist, and is it different from a New Ager? Is there more more hope for one than the other?
At the bottom, they're both irrational. Because Thomas Nagel wrote a book. I didn't quote Nagel. He's a philosopher at NYU, legal professor too. He wrote a book called, what was the name of that book? It's been a while, but it was a defense of reason and rationality in a postmodern world, and it was very good. But he's an atheist, and in the book he says that he's an atheist. He says, and I'm bothered by the fact that many of the smartest and best people that I know are not. He says, but I don't want the universe to be that way. It's not that I just don't believe that there's a God. I don't want there to be a God. And I'm like, well, I don't want to be fat and ugly either. But I mean, here I am. They're not rational. I sent him an email and I said, hey, why can't you take that last step? I mean, but that's to say that he wrote a book subsequently. It's probably 5 or 6 or 7 years old now. I can't remember the name of it. But he said that the Darwinian answer is no answer at all. And of course, he was crucified by the visiting team. And but his solution was that somehow life and consciousness is in every bit of the universe. The universe is conscious. And that's just not rational. Okay? It just isn't. Because matter, this book can't write itself. Show me a book that doesn't have an author, and I'll begin to believe, what you say about that. The DNA, you heard genetic code, information. It's the book of life. Well, the book of life has an author too, as it turns out. Okay? God. I mean, there's no book without an author. That's another argument too, by the way. There's some. Okay.
We're going to make this the last question.
Okay.
I wanted to have you clarify some logical steps
Okay.
that you showed there of the existence of matter, and you said matter can't come to existence from nothing. There is matter, therefore it exists, and that points to a being. Were you implying that being as God or being as the existence of matter? And if it is implying God, could you go through that logical step between the existence of matter being proof of the existence of God?
Yeah. Okay, that doesn't get you to theism necessarily, all right, and that's a good question. But I'm saying that if matter can't create itself, then something else had to create it. And that something else can't be matter, because matter can't create itself, can't create anything. And so that what created it was immaterial. So that gives you one part of a theistic God. That it gives you eternality, and it gives you immateriality. And then you can also make the case that it gives you necessity. In other words, a being that has always existed must necessarily exist. Otherwise it wouldn't exist, right? So that's how I would, I don't think that gets you necessarily all the way to the God of the Bible, but it gets you to a God, an eternal immaterial being. Has to be. What else could it be?
Could you just say that matter or that energy has always existed, and therefore you don't need an external?
You could say that. In fact, that's what science said for thousands of years up until the 1920s when Edwin Hubble discovered the red shift of light. Because the universe used to be the steady state theory. Well, it just always was here. So you don't need to explain its beginning because it didn't have a beginning. It just always is here. But now we know from the laws of thermodynamics and from the red shift and from cosmic background radiation, from other things, that the universe did have a beginning. It had a beginning. That's indisputable. And so they had to have a beginner. If there's a big bang, there's a big banger. Has to be. Otherwise, you're saying nothing did it.
Either nothing did it or it created itself, which is
Yes,
illogical.
yes.
Thank you, Tom.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank
Really
you.
appreciate it.